You high school dropout idiot, even without any common sense. David, the sales manager, suddenly yelled. What are you listening to during the meeting? Take it off now. Apparently, David is picking on my hearing aid. I had already informed him that I am hearing impaired. So, he should know that what I wear on my ear is a hearing aid, not an earphone. Even though he knows, David yells out as if my hearing aid was an earphone. The people from other departments don't know that I am hearing impaired. David's intention is probably to make me look like an ignorant fool in front of them. What's the point of doing that? I didn't feel like responding any further and ignored David's voice. Infuriated by my attitude, David stood up and suddenly knocked over my chair. As the meeting room buzzed, I collapsed to the floor. At that moment, the door of the meeting room opened. Sorry I'm late. In the midst of the commotion, Jones, the CEO, rushed into the meeting room. Jones noticed the tense atmosphere in the room, his eyes widening as he tried to grasp what was happening. As soon as he made eye contact with me lying on the floor, a frown appeared on his face, and his usually rosy cheeks turned pale. Knowing that Jones was watching, David pressed on. Who do you think you are, ignoring me? Don't you dare disrespect me. Jones's face turned even paler. All right, that's enough, I muttered to myself and gave Jones a sly smile. My name is James Smith, and I turned 40 this spring. I am now leading an average life as a businessman. However, my life has been a bit different from others. I have a particular trait. I am actually hearing impaired, almost completely deaf. I have early onset bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. This rare disease makes me feel like I'm always trapped at the bottom of the sea. I first noticed something was wrong with my hearing when I was in high school. The sounds around me started to distort, and instead of getting better, the symptoms kept worsening. Worried by the growing discomfort day by day, I went to the hospital and was diagnosed with this condition. Early onset bilateral sensorineural hearing loss is a disease that often develops when a patient is young, causing hearing to deteriorate in both ears. It involves damage to the nerves deep in the ears, gradually making it harder to hear over time. Eventually, I would lose my hearing completely. I spent my youth in fear of this impending silence. What used to be normal no longer was, and there were times I was scared to live. The fear of stepping into a silent world and learning how to survive in it. Balancing both was not easy. But just because I was losing my hearing didn't mean I could stop living. And losing my hearing didn't mean I had to give up on what I wanted to do. I decided to make the most of my remaining abilities and live as fully as possible, which enabled me to reach this age. Thanks to advancements in science, high-performance hearing aids were developed. Along with the progression of the disease, the sign language and lip reading skills I acquired have become vital for living. Lip reading involves understanding words by watching the movement of the speaker's lips, taking their expressions and the flow of the conversation into consideration. However, lip reading alone is not enough to completely understand what others are saying. Even with a hearing aid, it doesn't mean I can hear clearly. So, over time, I combine the fragments of words I hear with the movement of the speaker's lips. Doing this significantly improves my communication skills. I may not be able to converse as smoothly as a person with normal hearing, but in some aspects, I can even surpass them. Losing something allows you to gain something new. This is what I learned from experiencing this disease. Now, living an independent social life is not so difficult for me. This spring, I started working as a sales office clerk at a manufacturing company. The company I joined is called S Corporation, which manufactures electronic components. It is a subsidiary of S Holdings Group. I was assigned to the sales department, but my role is not sales, it's sales office work. Therefore, most of my duties involve support tasks like preparing documents. And I don't have many opportunities to speak directly with customers. Therefore, my hearing impairment rarely affects my work. and I can perform my assigned tasks well. However, the department I was assigned to had a major problem. That problem was David, the sales manager. He is an old-school, authoritarian boss who tries to control his subordinates with a high-handed attitude. Such a style might have been acceptable in the 70s, but it is out of place in today's world. On top of that, David looks down on those with lower education and physical disabilities. He believes that people with low education or disabilities are not worthy of evaluation. I had to drop out of high school due to the disease. So, my final educational attainment is a high school dropout. And I am hearing impaired. To David, I am an easy target. Our HR department sure doesn't hire good people. A high school dropout with no brains. And on top of that, he can't hear. We don't need such a useless person around. What a burden, hey, can you hear me? David said this to me on our first meeting during the introduction phase. Knowing I am hearing impaired, he probably thought I couldn't understand him and felt free to say whatever he wanted. Even if I could hear, David is the kind of person who would say such things without hesitation. I understood David's words perfectly. But I didn't let them shake me, brushing off his abusive language. Instead of getting angry at every unpleasant comment, I pretended not to hear and ignored them. This is a coping strategy I developed over the years. Moreover, this approach was convenient for carrying out my real mission. I'm sorry. Could you speak a bit slower? It's hard to catch everything when you talk so fast. I said apologetically, and David dismissively replied. So you can't hear after all, got it? I'm done. Despite David mocking me, I made sure to perform my job flawlessly. I couldn't give David any chance to exploit my weaknesses. This was the lesson I imposed on myself upon joining this sales department. If I made a mistake, David would use my hearing impairment or lack of education as an excuse to get rid of me. To prevent that, I had to do my job perfectly. At the same time, I kept an eye on David's actions. I watched to see if he was unfairly pressuring his subordinates or engaging in any unethical sales practices, making sure to monitor David's problematic behavior. Accumulating evidence against David is an effective way to protect myself. If I gather enough of his flaws, it becomes both a shield to defend myself and a spear to strike back when necessary. David's mistreatment of his subordinates was horrendous, to say the least. He would insult them in front of everyone, and sometimes drag them into the meeting room, making a lot of noise. It was easy to guess what was happening inside. He might be beating them. However, no one dared to oppose David's outrageous behavior. His authoritarian regime had been in place for so long that his subordinates were completely subdued. Additionally, I noticed something suspicious about the sales figures David reported. The volume of deliveries to a particular client was extraordinarily high. Given the client's size, it seemed impossible for them to handle such a large quantity. Moreover, the discount amount offered to this client was significantly larger than what other clients received. While giving discounts to large clients isn't unusual, the discount rate in this case appeared strange. Supplying an unusable quantity of electronic components at a low price. It seemed suspicious, to say the least. I suspected that David was selling them off illegally. Was David delivering a large volume of underperforming electronic components to client A at a discount and then having them resold to another company, possibly an overseas broker? If client A could sell the components at a higher price to a broker, they would make a profit. It's not a bad deal since they would earn money just by passing on the goods. However, a man like David wouldn't take such risks just out of loyalty to the company. If the goods were being resold overseas, that would be illegal. So, he was probably receiving some sort of kickback in return for introducing the broker. That was my hypothesis. If it were true, it would be a serious act of breach of trust, which means a crime. To verify my theory, I decided to probe David's subordinates. But everyone was tight-lipped, refusing to speak. David's grip on his subordinates was too strong. In the midst of this, David discovered what I was doing. "Hey, high school dropout. Why are you sneaking around like a rat? Scurrying around behind the scenes, snooping around." David pressured me with his rough words. "I'm not doing anything. I was just asking the sales staff about the delivery status." I deliberately spoke haltingly, pretending to be powerless. "Don't lie. You're suspecting me of reselling, aren't you?" "Whether intentionally or not." David lowered his voice. Because of that, I couldn't hear his words clearly. "Sorry, could you speak a bit louder? I couldn't hear you," I said apologetically. David smirked and lowered his voice even further. "So, you can't hear? No matter what you snoop around for, my subordinates won't talk. I'm covering up the poor sales performance for them. Having bad hearing must be tough. You missed my important words." David sneered as he spoke. From his expression, it was clear he was mocking me. But unfortunately, I couldn't get any information from his words. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear anything. Could you please repeat it?" I shouted loudly. David flashed a sinister smile and brought his mouth close to my ear. "No, wait." His loud voice was picked up by my hearing aid, causing a ringing in my ear. I covered my ear and glared at David. "What's that look? You've got something you want to say to me?" David said, hitting my head and walking out of the room. I felt the blood rush to my head. I couldn't let someone like him go unchecked. A sense of justice surged within me. I wanted to chase after him and knock him out. If I wanted, I could overpower David with force. But that wouldn't solve the root of the problem. I held back and calmed myself by noting down the information I had gathered visually instead of audibly. From that day on, David intensified his pressure on me. Until then, David had only marked my hearing impairment and my lack of education, but recently his harassment had become more vicious. He would deliberately speak in a whisper so I couldn't hear him, or sneak up behind me and snatch my hearing aid. These were petty and malicious acts that you wouldn't expect from someone in his position as a manager. Each time, I felt a surge of anger and tried to resist David. But to achieve my real goal, I had to suppress my rage and endure it. After enduring many such days, I reached my breaking point, and then an accident happened. It happened during an emergency sales meeting. The attendees were the directors and the department heads of various sales divisions. I was to attend this meeting as the document preparer for David's sales department. It was my first time attending a sales meeting. I didn't feel it was necessary for me to be there since the documents I prepared were not particularly complex. In fact, David was the only sales manager who brought an office clerk to the meeting. So, there had to be a special reason why David insisted on my attendance. I paid close attention to David's behavior before the meeting started. As soon as the meeting began, David made an action. "You high school dropout idiot, even without any common sense." While another department was giving their sales report, David, who was sitting next to me, suddenly shouted, "What are you listening to during the meeting? Take it off now." Apparently, David was picking on my hearing aid. I had already informed him that I am hearing impaired. So, he should know that what I wear on my ear is a hearing aid, not an earphone. Even though he knows, David yells out as if my hearing aid was an earphone. The other participants and directors don't know that I am hearing impaired. David's intention is probably to make me look like an ignorant fool in front of them. What's the point of doing that? Does he hate me that much? Or is he retaliating because I dug into the risk-selling issue? I didn't feel like responding any further and ignored David's voice. Infuriated by my attitude, David stood up and suddenly kicked over my chair. As the meeting room buzzed, I collapsed to the floor. At that moment, the door to the meeting room opened. "Sorry I'm late." In the midst of the commotion, CEO Jones rushed into the meeting room. Jones noticed the tense atmosphere in the room, his eyes widening as he tried to grasp what was happening. When he saw me lying on the floor, a frown appeared on his face, and his usually rosy cheeks turned pale. Aware that Jones was watching, David pressed on. Who do you think you are? Ignoring me. Don't you dare disrespect me. Jones's face turned even paler. All right, this is enough. I muttered to myself and gave Jones a sly smile. David looked at Jones, seeking recognition for his actions. He probably thought he was impressing the directors and department heads present by scolding someone for wearing earphones during the meeting. However, contrary to David's expectations, Jones's face showed intense disgust. David, what do you think you're doing? Jones shouted angrily at David. The unexpected turn of events caused David to falter for a moment. However, he quickly regained his composure and spoke casually. My subordinate was wearing earphones during the meeting, so I reprimanded him. Then he showed a defiant attitude. As I listened to their conversation, I slowly got up and sat back in my chair. I threw a contemptuous smile at David. Seeing this, David's anger flared, and he took a deep breath to shout at me. But Jones stopped him. Are you saying you didn't know he was hearing impaired, David? What? David was at a loss for words. What he has in his ear is not an earphone. You knew it was a hearing aid, yet you acted so cruelly. Jones spoke calmly, but his underlying anger was evident. Well, I was. Caught off guard, David was flustered. What David didn't expect was that Jones knew about my hearing impairment. He thought he was the only one in the room who knew my secret. David assumed this and tried to paint me as an ignorant troublemaker. But once it was revealed that he behaved like that, knowing my condition, all the blame shifted to David. The cold stares from the meeting attendees began to focus on David. In the midst of this, Jones glanced at me uneasily. Something that shouldn't have happened had happened, and it was bad news. That was probably what Jones was thinking. President, let's cancel today's sales meeting. There are more pressing issues to resolve before the meeting. I looked Jones in the eyes and spoke firmly. David quickly stepped in front of me, flustered. How dare you, a low-ranking employee, say such things? A high school dropout like you has no right to speak to the president. Shut the heck your mouth up. David yelled, but Jones immediately interrupted. David, you're the one who needs to be quiet. Jones glared at David with disdain. Then he quickly shifted his gaze to me and spoke apologetically. You're right, let's cancel today's meeting. Who is that guy? Although no one said anything out loud, I could sense this question echoing in everyone's minds. The attendees exchanged puzzled glances at Jones's way of talking to me. They found it strange that President Jones was speaking so formally to me, a mere employee. David felt the same. President, why are you to this dude? Just be quiet. Jones shouted without even giving David a chance to talk back. The meeting room fell completely silent. David's misconduct, the president's odd behavior, my identity. Various questions filled everyone's minds, leaving them unable to keep up. A murky atmosphere hung in the air. Today's meeting is adjourned. We'll reschedule and let you know. Thank you all. Jones addressed the attendees with words of appreciation, urging them to leave. David hesitated, unsure whether to leave the room or stay. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable in the tense atmosphere, he took a step forward. But Jones stopped him with a hand gesture. David, come to the president's office, and you too, James. David's eyes widened in shock. The fact that the president calling me James likely fueled his suspicion. He glared at me, but the emotion in his eyes had shifted from hatred to suspicion. It wasn't long before David and I entered the president's office. We were directed to sit on the sofas, and we sat side by side. We hadn't exchanged a word on the way from the meeting room to here. There was nothing more to say to David at this point. On the other hand, David's expression was stiff, perhaps due to fear of me. My presence had shifted from an object of ridicule to something unknown and threatening. Jones sank into the sofa on the other side. However, no words came out immediately. It seemed Jones was unsure how to start the conversation. Curious about what was going to happen, David directed his inquisitive gaze at the president. Noticing this, Jones finally spoke. "David, I think it's best to tell you who he really is first." Jones spoke while glancing at me. "What is this about? Why is the president speaking so formally to this guy?" David said, not bothering to hide his frustration. Jones cut him off. "He is an investigator sent from the parent company." David's face froze at these words. He then looked at me with a fearful expression, trying to gauge my reaction. I gave him a slight nod and a smile. "My actual position is with the investigation office of S Holdings. I am here to monitor compliance within the group companies. There was a reason I was sent to S Corporation. It's because there was a leak from within S Corporation. The investigation was focused on the sales department, specifically the department headed by David, where reports of misconduct were rampant, prompting my involvement. I joined the company under a false identity. Only a few people in the HR department and President Jones knew about my real identity. He's a spy, this coward." David's emotions raged. He wanted to demean me by using the word spy. But in this situation, it was David who was on the edge, not me. He should be the one begging for forgiveness. However, it seemed that he couldn't make that judgment quickly. "David, watch your language." Jones reprimanded David. Taking advantage of the pause in the conversation, I spoke up. "Manager David, I apologize for infiltrating your team under false pretenses. I'm sorry, however. This allowed us to discover many issues with your work behavior and how you treat your subordinates. Due to my hearing impairment, it was challenging for me to jump into a conversation with words flying around. It was fortunate for me that Jones silenced David. Seeing that neither of them spoke, I continued. "Manager David, it seems you've been quite rough with your subordinates, yelling at them in front of others, and even resorting to physical punishment." As I slowly spoke, pausing between phrases, David interrupted. "Wait a minute, I don't yell at my subordinates. That's just tough love and physical punishment. I would never do that. Who said that? Bring them here." David maintained his confident demeanor. He was sure his control over his subordinates was absolute, reflecting his confidence that no one would turn against him. However, even without any dissent from his subordinates, David's actions still deserved punishment. David's behavior towards me was clearly against compliance. Whether I was an investigator or a spy, he couldn't escape his own responsibility. "Your actions towards your subordinates will eventually be revealed. But let's put that aside for now, however. Your behavior towards me is inexcusable." David had looked down on me because of my hearing impairment and my educational background, making me a target for his ridicule. In addition to previous harassment, he tried to make me look like a naughty one listening to music during a meeting and appear like a fool. In today's world, with strict compliance standards, such misdeeds would not be tolerated, unlike in the 70s. "Manager David, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Well, David was speechless. I shifted my gaze from the stumped David to Jones, who was looking downcast. A manager, who has quite a responsibility for his position, had committed these acts. Not only were they witnessed by me, an investigator, but they were actually committed against me. Not even the president could cover this up. Please make sure this issue is properly addressed. Just because it's an internal matter doesn't mean it should be brushed under the rug, I said firmly, and Jones showed an apologetical expression. "Understood. Manager David will face appropriate disciplinary action and will be made to reflect on his behavior." David listened with his head down, looking thoroughly dejected, but it's too early for him to feel defeated. His abuse towards his subordinates is certainly a problem, but more importantly, he's involved in a bigger issue. That issue is the main focus of the investigation. James, so, does this conclude the investigation? I could see the relief in Jones's expression. Demoting David from his position as manager and cutting his salary might satisfy the head office, But this is just the beginning. What are you talking about, President? This is just a side thing. The main issue starts now. I smiled meaningfully, and Jones's expression tensed. On the other hand, David seemed indifferent, thinking the investigation into him was already over. You're being naive, David, I told myself. President, there's no need for Manager David to reflect on his actions. My words made Jones's face contort with discomfort. He was struggling to understand the meaning of no need for reflection. David, meanwhile, looked puzzled, his gaze wandering. Perhaps he thought he was off the hook. If so, he's gravely mistaken. Manager David needs to be terminated immediately. The reason is that he has committed acts of breach of trust. This is a crime and a serious compliance violation. It cannot be settled with mere reflection. At that moment, David's face turned red. David tried to say something, but only mumbled, unable to form a coherent response. It was Jones who spoke first. David committed breach of trust. What do you mean? Jones asked, trying to understand my words, while watching my expression closely. He might have expected David was harsh on his subordinates. But the breach of trust was likely a complete surprise. He has been soliciting favors from clients in exchange for kickbacks. I explained the irregularities in the sales department's revenue under David. I also mentioned that we had sent investigators to those clients and confirmed the findings. Of course, sending investigators was preceded by thorough internal investigations. David underestimated me because of my hearing impairment. Even though I wore a hearing aid, he thought speaking softly would ensure I couldn't hear him. He had learned from experience that I couldn't hear quiet conversations and carelessly spoke about things he shouldn't have. It's true that if he whispered behind my back, I wouldn't have been able to hear him. But if he was within my line of sight, it was a different story. I can read lips to a certain extent and understand what the other person is saying. If I can narrow down the context of the conversation, my comprehension becomes quite accurate. Manager David, you made careless statements in front of me. I've documented everything as evidence. You pretended to be deaf and deceived me. David was furious. He still didn't understand his position. This was not the time to argue about my hearing abilities. I didn't hear you with my ears, but I listened with my eyes. I smirked at David and explained about my lip-reading skills. David's eyes widened in shock as he listened. I pressed on further. I recounted with great accuracy where David had spoken and what he had said, watching his face losing color as I spoke. Every conversation in the meeting room without lowering the blinds was completely visible to me. I also know about the insults directed at me and the joke orders you placed on your subordinates. David sank deeply into the sofa. Seeing this, Jones raised his voice. David, you're an absolute rogue. I overlooked some of your issues because of your good sales performance, but it was all a sham, you idiot. Jones shouted, biting his lip in anger. But David, in a state of shock, showed no reaction. The truth is, I came to S Corporation because of a leak about this issue. A sales department employee, forced by David to facilitate illegal reselling, probably couldn't bear the guilt and reported it anonymously. During the investigation, there was a moment when David almost discovered me. But my hearing impairment helped disguise my true identity. President Jones, I will report all of this to the head office. You should be prepared for the consequences. I calmly informed Jones. He grabbed David by the collar, pulled him up, and said face to face, "This is all your fault. Get out of my office." Jones's voice was loud enough to echo in the office. However, it seemed David didn't hear it at all. From David's perspective, cornered as he was, the president's words were no longer worth listening to. Enraged by David's attitude, Jones kicked the back of the sofa David was sitting on with all his might. David tumbled to the ground. Watching him, I couldn't help but smirk. David is a piece of work, but Jones isn't much better. Disgusted, I gave a cold laugh and quickly left the president's office. David was given the penalty of dismissal. A detailed investigation revealed that the number of illegal resales and the amount of kickbacks were far greater than expected, implicating the entire sales department was involved. In other words, almost everyone in the sales department knew about it. However, the subordinates were not pursued further since their only benefit was a reduction in sales quotas. Given David's attitude that I witnessed, it's understandable why they couldn't resist. David will likely be sued by the company. The amount of damages is still being calculated, but it will undoubtedly be a sum too large for him to repay through regular wages. After being fired, David was abandoned by his wife and daughter, whom he had met through an introduction from his superiors, and now lives alone in an old wooden apartment. Most of his assets, including his house and car, were in his wife's name, leaving him with very little money. It's unclear how David will live from now on, but his path will undoubtedly be extremely difficult. As for President Jones, he was transferred to another group company. He ended up in a local construction company as the head of the General Affairs Department. Though he holds the title of manager, he only has one part-time employee under him. In short, he was demoted. This was the consequence of his involvement in the recent scandal. His salary was significantly reduced, and the work environment was much harsher. Even so, Jones accepted it. Perhaps he had no other choice. As for me, I completed the investigation at S Corporation and returned to headquarters. Despite the unpleasant role I had to play, I received words of gratitude from the sales department, which David had managed. Reports indicated that, since the tyrant is gone, they were now able to conduct proper sales activities. This time, I used my hearing impairment, which I usually consider a disadvantage, to uncover the misconduct. I plan to continue focusing on what I can do, rather than lamenting what I can't. Not being able to hear doesn't mean I shouldn't live, and it doesn't mean I have to give up.